Welcome to this video lecture titled Introduction to Rogerian Argumentation. Before viewing the video, you should have read Chapter 10 out of Essentials of Argument called Writing the Rogerian Argument Paper. That was a PDF file. And then also from Rhetorical Readings for Advanced Writers, the article called Rogerian Argument in the Context of Situation. I'll do several things in this video. I'm basically trying to pull from both of those readings just to kind of make sure everybody understands the major points of those readings. So first of all, just an introduction to Rogerian argument, distinguishing how it differs from traditional argumentation, considering what are the advantages and disadvantages of this alternative style of argumentation, and then looking a little bit more closely at the article Rogerian Argument in the Context of Situations, a little bit more difficult read probably. And then I'll end by modeling a Rogerian response to an article that sets you up well to write your own paper that's coming up. First of all, Carl Rogers is where we pull the theory from. He was a psychotherapist who designed, back in the 1950s, a counseling technique to help reduce conflict and establish common ground between people who were really butting heads, had divergent positions, and really couldn't kind of move past that. His theory is based on empathetic listening, really trying to listen to other sides, other points of view, and being empathetic. There were three writing studies professors, Richard Young, Alton Becker, and Kenneth Pike, who pulled from his psychotherapy theory and actually applied it to writing studies, more specifically to writing arguments. So what are the goals of Rogerian argument? Again, you should be able to figure this out from the readings, but just as kind of a way of highlighting those, some of the goals: let the reader know you're listening and working to understand what they're saying. Show the reader you can see how their positions are valid in some context or under certain conditions. You might not agree with everything they're saying, but you've taken the time to try to understand what they're saying and consider how they might view things that way because of certain experiences they've had, certain conditions in which something might happen. You can point out, goal is to point out shared values, experiences, attitudes, and perceptions between you and the reader in order to help find common ground. And another goal is to help propose solutions and or ways to move the conversation forward, at least, to continue a dialogue instead of, just kind of shutting a conversation down essentially, but continuing more of a dialogue by pulling from some of your views and theirs. So those are some of the primary goals of Rogerian argument. Very different from traditional argumentations. What are some of the features of Rogerian argument? So in other words, what are the steps you go through when you're performing and making a Rogerian argument? Going along with those goals. First, you're supposed to summarize somebody else's ideas or views. So you restate the opposition's views non-judgmentally and empathetically. That's pretty key. You can't just sarcastically say, oh, I hear what you're saying, here's what you're saying. You're supposed to non-judgmentally and empathetically really demonstrate you're trying to understand somebody else's point of view. Again, you draw upon empathetic listening there. The next step in performing a Rogerian argument is to validate some of their points, explain how an opposing view or position makes sense in some contexts. I can see why you see it this way. I can see why you believe X. Then you try to establish common ground. That's like taking it to a level deeper. You find common ground on the level of like beliefs, values, experiences, interests. So that's, a lot of students are a little confused between the difference in validating some of their points and finding common ground. Validating is like literally restating some of the points they're making and saying you can see how those points make sense in some context or under certain circumstances. Finding common ground is finding shared values, like, okay, we value education, we value life, things like that. So you're finding on a deeper level some common ground between you and somebody who has an opposing viewpoint to yours. Then, this is how this is different from traditional argument. After doing those three things, that's when you make your own argument. How do your views differ from the opponent's and why? And you support that argument, of course. So you do ultimately, in a Rogerian argument, make an argument and defend it and support it. And ultimately, on some level, you're trying to persuade your readers or your viewers of that argument. But you do those other steps first to draw your reader in, by demonstrating you're really trying to listen and understand what they're saying and find common ground and common values first, as a way to draw readers in so that they'll actually listen to your argument. And then kind of concluding by trying to find some consensus or mutual ground to move the conversation forward by pulling ideas from your views and the opposition's views. Again, the ultimate goal there is to keep like a dialogue open instead of just making an argument, shutting things down, and that's it. So again, how does traditional argumentation style? That's probably what you're used to, especially in writing academic essays. You state your thesis, make your argument up front, spend the rest of the essay defending it. Maybe you acknowledge a counter argument at the end, or maybe not, and that's it. So again, trying to understand more specifically the difference between that argumentation style that you're probably used to and Rogerian. So in traditional, the author states their claim and proves it by drawing on various types of proof. That's all your evidence, your reasoning. The goal there is to convince the audience that the author's claims are valid and you're right. The author uses a rebuttal toward the end, perhaps, not even always, to demonstrate essentially that the opposition is wrong. So you bring in opposing viewpoints sometimes, but you usually do it to shoot them down. And the emphasis, of course, in traditional argumentation style is to win the argument. Rogerian is very different, and a lot of students aren't familiar with it or haven't experienced it, haven't gotten to try it out. And in my experience, a lot of students kind of really appreciate this unit and the opportunity to learn about a different argumentation style and practice it. So again, in Rogerian, the author instead restates the opposition's views up front, non-judgmentally and empathetically. The author takes time to validate some of the opposition's ideas or points, and find common ground before making their own argument and supporting it. And then you work to move the conversation forward or keep a dialogue open by proposing a solution or a way to view things that moves things forward. The emphasis here, of course, is not on winning, but to open or keep a dialogue going, understanding, listening to each other, and learning from each other. Very different. Why and or when would you use it? It comes in really handy when one or both sides of an argument have strongly held opinions or feel like their entire value systems are being challenged. This can kind of reduce the sense of threat of the audience that you're working with. So something like abortion or race issues, some gender issues can be really heated, and people are very grounded in their views, and the conversation or the arguments can get very tense, very heated. I mean, and you can feel like you're just bucking heads, basically. So that might be a good time to try out a Rogerian argument instead of just making a traditional argument. You can use it for reducing conflict and establishing common ground. It can help release tension, of course. And it encourages dialogue, negotiation, and working toward understanding each other's views. So again, it's not just about winning, it's about listening to opposing viewpoints, trying to understand them better, continue a dialogue, and see if you can kind of pull from different viewpoints and maybe even expand your own views. As one of the readings talks about, there are some disadvantages to Rogerian, some things you might lose if you use this style. For some, it can be perceived by the audience as the author being insincere or manipulative. If you're saying, oh, I hear what you're saying, I understand what you're saying, it makes sense in these contexts, but here's why you should believe X. Sometimes the audience can read that as the author or the person making the argument being insincere or trying to manipulate them. Ultimately, when you are making a Rogerian argument, you want to be sincere and not manipulative. That's not the point. If you're doing it correctly, you're doing it well. And you certainly don't want it to be perceived as insincere or manipulative. It can be difficult to do as well. It's not easy to perform Rogerian. We're very much more used to performing traditional argumentation. And for some authors, it feels like giving in to the opposition. It becomes a power issue. If I already feel like I'm in a minority position and I'm in a powerless position, by trying to find common ground with and validate some of the points of somebody who perhaps is more powerful than I am and is putting me in a powerless position, it can feel like reinforcing that. You'll learn more about that when you read the next reading called Feminist Responses to Rogerian Argument. So that goes even further into that disadvantage. Rogerian strategies, I don't need to read through this. This is from your reading from chapter 10. Again, it's a PDF file, but I would revisit this. This is a really good way to kind of, again, compare traditional argumentation strategies, in this case, with Rogerian argument strategies. And it even breaks it down in terms of the rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, pathos. What are some strategies for demonstrating ethos in traditional argument versus strategies for demonstrating ethos in a Rogerian argument, and so on and so on. So that's, I just want to call your attention to that. It'd be worth revisiting that, looking back at it, and as those are actual strategies. Richard Young's article, Rogerian Argument in the Context of Situation, again, is probably the more tough of the two readings, so I wanted to break down some of the main points. Young was one of the three writing studies professors who pulled from Carl Rogers' psychotherapy theories and brought it to writing studies and actually writing argumentation. The idea was that it could help reduce an opponent's feelings of threat and essentially open them to considering alternatives, establishing and maintaining communication, or establishing combined efforts to solve a common problem. The article that you just read, Richard Young published 20 years after he and his colleagues came out with this theory and introduced it to writing teachers, essentially. And so he's looking back after 20 years and looking critically at their own theory and how they applied it to writing studies. He concludes that one thing they did not do well was they didn't pay enough attention to how the situation for each argument varies and can play a role in whether or not you should use Rogerian argument or how you use it and whether or not it could be effective. Breaking down the situation, he was talking more specifically about timeliness, and the duration of time that you use to make a Rogerian argument, and then considering constraints of the rhetorical situation. You'd need to address those and consider those, as we talked about previously when we were talking about rhetorical situation. Again, you'd need to think about the rhetorical situation. Is it the right rhetorical situation in which to use Rogerian argument style, or if so, do you use it certain ways? Do you use certain elements of it depending on the situation? So he recognized that when they initially brought the theory to writing studies and teaching it to students in their writing, that they had kind of neglected to address that. Other scholars argued that Rogerian argument is not useful at all when both sides of an argument are steadfast. They believe so heartily in their opinions and their beliefs that they're just not willing to move on anything or open their minds. So some scholars thought it's not useful in that situation, but he actually disagrees and says that there's some benefits to using Rogerian argument even when both sides are steadfast, because here's a list of some of the other benefits. Again, if the goal of Rogerian is not to win, if it's to keep a dialogue open, understand each other, move things forward, maybe learn from each other's viewpoints, he's saying there's still benefits to using Rogerian argument even when both sides are really steadfast on their opinions. So here's some of the benefits that he pulls out. We can develop greater understanding of our own and others' views. It's not just becoming to understand the other person's views better. We learn more about theirs. It helps us understand our own better. We can produce a heightened awareness of others. It can soften harsh attitudes that we have toward others' beliefs if we take the time to actually be an empathetic listener to what we consider an opposing viewpoint. Doesn't mean we'll change our minds, but we might have less harsh attitudes toward people who hold those beliefs. He also said it can produce an emerging mutual respect between both sides. Again, doesn't mean you're changing opinions, but maybe you can respect the other side. It can produce a willingness to engage in and or continue in a dialogue on the issue, which in many ways could be a goal instead of just winning an argument. So now I want to kind of have you practice, or us practice or model performing a Rogerian response to something. In order to do that, you need to pause the video actually and go read this article. So I've got the name of the article here. Just search for it on the internet, and the author, it's from salon.com, called Black People Are Not Here to Teach You What So Many White Americans Just Can't Grasp. So if you would, pause the video and probably take 5 to 10 minutes at the most. Go read that article and then come back to the video. Okay, so hopefully you went and took the time to read that article. Otherwise, some of this won't make much. So I would like to model the kind of analysis I'm asking my students to perform. Normally in a face-to-face class, we would kind of walk through this together, but in an online class, the best I can do, I think, is to kind of model how we would respond using this particular theory to an article. So again, these are the 5 steps of the Rogerian argument style. So first you have to summarize empathetically and non-judgmentally the author's points. You might have different points under each of these. If you were writing a paper responding to this, that's totally fine. So I just pulled some things out. How I would summarize it is I would say that the author's arguing people of color are not obligated to teach white people about race. White people can educate themselves. People assume if a person of color is not educating white people about race, they're actually complicit in racism or furthering racism. Again, this is what the author is saying. I'm summarizing the author's points. And putting people of color in the position of teaching others about racism actually reinforces traditional and problematic power dynamics. So that's how I would summarize the article. Some of the points that the author makes that I can validate, I can see the person's point in certain contexts or certain circumstances. Here, sometimes I pull quotes. The point the author makes: the marginalized are tasked with being educators of those who've previously done precious little thinking about racism and privilege. So that's something I can see. I can validate that person's argument that that's problematic. Another point is it's likely very tiring and burdensome for people of color to answer ignorant questions about racism or talk with non-persons of color who are intentionally provocative. That's one of the author's points. Not people who are have kind of done their research, become pretty educated, and they're trying to further some of their knowledge. And then another point I could easily validate and understand where the person's coming from is when she says the failure to erase racial inequality doesn't result from persons of color's failure to educate white people. That's not where the problem lies. Trying to find common ground with the author on a deeper level, I would say we both value equity and equality. I'd say we both want to address and eradicate racism, and we both believe in educating ourselves, having some responsibility to educate ourselves. The counter argument, so how would I push back? How might my views differ a little bit from this author's? I actually agree with most of what the author's saying. So here I had to challenge myself a little bit to come up with a counter argument. And actually I'm pulling here from points that my students in previous classes have brought up. So sometimes students have countered by saying this may make non-persons of color afraid to ask questions at times, and to people that may be appropriate. There may be times and questions they have that are appropriate, and people who are appropriate to ask those to, and reading something like this, reading the author's argument, might make them too scared to do that, and that could be a problem. Another point sometimes students have pushed back on is some non-persons of color may be well-meaning and think that they are educated on racism, but may lack the experience to know what they don't actually know. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And again, may not be ignorant or being provocative, but they genuinely feel like they're educated on it and they want to know more. And another point students have pushed back on is to say people may learn incorrect or problematic information about racism when they are self-educating. If they're looking through internet searches and reading articles, they may actually learn problematic things about racism that are unfair or racist themselves. And then, so again, trying to conclude, if you're Rogerian response, you're trying to move forward, either find a solution or at least kind of pull from both viewpoints to keep the dialogue going. Some of the points you might make would be to begin by educating yourself as much as possible, obviously. Approach friends who may be able to shed more light on racism, but demonstrate first that you know what you know and how you've tried to learn about racism. So maybe you could approach persons of color to ask more questions, but present it first as, look, this is what I already know. This is how I've attempted to educate myself. Can I ask more questions, essentially? And that goes along with the next point. Approach persons of color thoughtfully and empathetically, and don't assume that they will want to talk about racism. Okay, present it as a way like, Would you be comfortable having more of a conversation? This is what I already know. This is what I've researched. This is what I've experienced. Could I ask you a few more questions? So that's kind of a way of pulling from both sides, pulling from the author's point of not assuming that persons of color are obligated to do this, but not necessarily assuming that they're not willing to or they wouldn't want to. Depends on the person, depends on the situation. So that's kind of an outline of a way of modeling a Rogerian response to this article. And so I'll leave you with some questions to consider. You don't have to write answers to these questions, but these would be useful things to spend some time thinking about after performing a Rogerian response to this article. How did it feel to respond to the author in Rogerian style, either listening to my response or how would you respond? How does it feel? What did you gain and what did you lose by responding as an empathetic listener? Do you feel like going through that Rogerian response, going through those steps, makes you lose something or helps you gain something? Holloway, the author, employed a traditional style of argumentation. That should be pretty obvious. She made an argument and she defended it, and that's it. She was not performing a Rogerian argument. So another question to consider, what might her argument have looked like if she employed the Rogerian style of argumentation? How might that have changed? And that goes along with the next question. What might she have gained and or lost if she had made her own argument in a Rogerian style? And in what rhetorical situations would her argument have been more effective in Rogerian style and why, or less effective and why? So in other words, if she had different audiences, would Rogerian argument style have served her better or worse, and why, if the rhetorical situation changed? Okay, so again, trying to pull together some of what you learned in the first unit about rhetoric and rhetorical situation, apply that to Rogerian argument. So when is it a good time to try out this other argumentation style? When is it not? What do you gain? What do you lose when you use this different style of argumentation?